The U.S.-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue is in Beijing this month. Secretary Clinton of the State Department, Secretary Geithner of the Treasury Department will be leading a big U.S. delegation to Beijing for these talks. They're important because they set the tone for U.S.-China economic relations for many months to come. And they're important because of jobs, and that's what's really at stake here in these talks, is our ability to produce good-paying, family-supporting jobs and to have strong communities in the United States by having a more balanced trade relationship with China, where we're exporting more to China and they're importing less to the United States, so that we can balance things out and give our businesses and workers an opportunity. So with that introduction, we have prepared an index of key numbers to consider as these talks move forward. Over the last 7 years, the U.S. has lost 2.4 million jobs to China because of our imbalanced relationship. That's, in some states, more than 2% of employment, so that's a considerable figure, especially when we face 10% unemployment and we're trying to dig out of a jobs hole. To have it compounded and digging it deeper with this trade imbalance is a real problem. 2.4 million jobs. We desperately need those back. There are 435 congressional districts across the nation in every state that have lost jobs to China. We actually have them on our website, AmericanManufacturing.org. You can go to the home page and you can click to see on your own congressional districts exactly how many jobs have been lost due to imbalanced trade with China. By far and away, China is America's biggest trade problem. China now accounts for 80% of our global trade deficit in goods when you leave oil out of the equation. That means that if we fix the China problem, we'll be able to balance our trade account and start creating jobs in the United States again. 5 to 1 is the ratio of Chinese imports to U.S. exports. Some people like to talk about how many jobs are supported by U.S. exports to China. And it's true, some are supported by U.S. exports to China, but many more are lost by that 5 figure, the $5 worth of imports that are coming into the U.S. for every dollar we're sending to China in goods. And that's the balance we need to get rid of if we're going to create jobs in this country. 6.8 is the rate that the yuan, which is the Chinese currency, is pegged at against the dollar. So for every dollar, it converts into 6.8 yuan. That number has been steady for the last 22 months, and it means two things. Number one, that it's not reflecting market forces, because there's this peg where every other currency against the United States kind of goes like this. And number two, it means that China's gaining an unfair advantage because they're manipulating their currency. Their currency should be valued much more than that. So there should be like maybe 4 yuan to the dollar or something even lower than that. But instead, it puts American manufacturers in a hole when we're trying to sell goods to China. It makes them much more expensive than they should be. It makes Chinese goods much less expensive than they should be coming into the United States. 40% is the estimate for the value by which the yuan is undervalued, and that's an estimate that comes from the Institute for International Economics, which is generally a very pro-free trade think tank based here in Washington, D.C. And so it means that there's a 40% advantage that Chinese goods have coming in, and a 40% disadvantage that American exporters have when they're trying to ship goods to China. It's hard to find a good estimate of how many dollars worth of Treasury holdings China has, but the best estimates that we've seen are in the $1 trillion range. That means that in China's bank accounts right now, there are $1 trillion in dollar bills, not literally, but figuratively, sitting there. And China has this sort of surplus, and we rack up deficits month after month after month. And it's precisely because of our trade policy. That's something that we hope Secretary Clinton and Secretary Geithner can begin to address in their talks. $40 billion is the estimated amount that China is adding every month to their surplus. So on top of that trillion, an additional $40 billion every month are being added to that bank account. And that's in large part because China's running enormous surpluses, primarily with the United States. That's really bad for the global economy, and it's really bad for our bilateral relationship. 1.5 is the percentage by which Paul Krugman, who's a New York Times columnist, a Princeton professor, but most importantly a Nobel Prize economist, has estimated that China's mercantilist policies are reducing global growth. So basically the global economy could grow by 1.5% more than it is right now if China was to have a balanced trade account as opposed to be running these massive surpluses that they're able to accumulate through currency manipulation. 1.4 million, the number of jobs that Paul Krugman estimates that we will lose in the United States if we don't address China's currency manipulation. That's why it's so critical to get this started right now, because we've been losing these jobs for the past 7 or 8 years. We're not going to get them back overnight, but if we don't act, and this is what Paul Krugman says, we're going to lose 1.4 million additional jobs. That's going to be a huge blow for the American economy when we already have 10% unemployment. 1.2 million, the number of jobs that Fred Berkston of the Institute for International Economics, is the amount that he estimates that we'll be able to grow our employment by if China revalues its currency peg and revalues the yuan by 40%, which would bring it to a market-based value against the dollar. That's a substantial amount of job growth that we could get. Now, if China were to revalue its currency by 25% instead of 40%, that would still gain 600,000 jobs in the United States, according to Fred Berkston of the Institute for International Economics. In 2005, 67 U.S. senators voted for a proposal by Senator Schumer of New York, Senator Graham of South Carolina, to slap a 27% tariff on Chinese goods unless they revalued their currency. Now, that bill didn't pass, but within a couple of weeks, China did revalue its currency. It's since repegged it, but the moral of this story is that China's only going to respond if it knows there are consequences. The Senate provided those consequences last time. Let's hope that Senator Graham, Senator Schumer will do the same thing again, and let's hope that Secretary Geithner, Secretary Clinton will make some progress in Beijing. Paul Krugman recommends that we put a 25% tariff on Chinese goods until it revalues its currency. He thinks this whole thing would be over in a couple of months, that if we put a 25% tariff on, China would revalue its currency and we would achieve the equilibrium that he thinks is so important. Now, there is precedence for this. We did something similar in 1971. Richard Nixon put an import tariff on certain goods coming from Japan and Europe. Within months, they revalued their currencies. Ronald Reagan threatened to do the same thing in the 80s. They revalued their currency. And so it's a proven strategy, but we have to follow through for it to make a difference. 0, this may be the most important number. 0 is the cost to the U.S. Treasury of forcing China to change its currency policy. It will create, as Fred Berkston estimates, up to 1.2 million jobs, and it will cost taxpayers absolutely nothing, and that's just the type of stimulus that we're